In the sweltering heat of a Florida swamp, a young woman coldly tossed two German shepherd puppies into a crowded alligator pond. As the jaws of a predator snapped shut, one man dove into the water without hesitation. One pup was gravely injured, the other left trembling. But from that moment, a powerful story began of survival trust and how two tiny lives would go on to transform one man's world forever. What truly happened after that leap? The air in Cypress Grove hung thick and slow like syrup. The kind of summer humidity that clung to skin and filled lungs with the weight of everything it touched. The murky surface of the gator pond shimmered in the harsh midday sun, a glassy mirror cracked only by the gentle ripple of a hidden tail or the lazy blink of an ancient eye. Families in wide-brimmed hats lined the wooden observation deck, their chatter mixing with the buzz of insects and the distant hum of cicadas. It was just another day in the Florida wetlands, until it wasn't. Jonas stood near the railing, clipboard in hand, half listening to a question about reptile feeding habits, while keeping one eye on the water. His khaki shirt clung damply to his back, his boots were already dusted with dry mud, and his routine was the same as it had been for the past 7 years. Steady, predictable, necessary. But then came a sound that didn't belong. A gasp, sharp and collective, followed by silence so sudden it seemed to suck all the heat from the air. He turned just in time to see her. She wasn't tall, and she wasn't angry. She didn't yell or curse or look around in a frenzy. She simply lifted her arms as if discarding something unimportant. And dangling from her hands, two small, trembling bundles of fur. German shepherd puppies, maybe 10 weeks old at most. All ears and paws and baby roundness. One of them gave a hopeful little wag of his tail. The other blinked into the sun, confused. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. Then she let go. The world slowed. The puppies dropped suspended for a breathless second, their tiny bodies tumbling helplessly through the air. The splash that followed was so small, it sounded like a pebble being thrown into a fountain. The woman turned and walked away, her pale dress catching the wind like a sail. She disappeared into the crowd before anyone even moved, but Jonas had already leapt. His boots hit the mud with a squelch that sent dragonflies scattering. Behind him, he barely registered the shouts of his colleague Delaney, calling his name, warning him, maybe, but there was no time for warnings now. The gator pond wasn't just a shallow tourist enclosure. It was deep, it was real, and it housed over a dozen fully grown alligators, each a blend of prehistoric reflexes and cold-blooded precision. The water was colder than expected, slicing through the heat like glass. His eyes scanned wildly. One puppy, the smaller of the two, was flailing near the edge, paddling in wild circles. The other, where was the other? And then he saw it. A shadow gliding with terrifying grace beneath the surface. A long, muscular shape, low and fast. Cutter. Jonas knew him instantly. Not the biggest gator in the pond, but fast, always fast. Cutter had been trouble for years, aggressive, territorial, and efficient, and his yellow eyes were locked on the struggling puppy. No, Jonas whispered, already moving. He splashed and kicked arms, pumping legs, churning through the water as Cutter surged forward. 20 feet, 15. The puppy yelped once, a thin, watery sound swallowed by the swamp. 10 feet. Cutter lunged. Jonas watched in horror as the jaws opened wide and white and waiting, and then snapped shut around the tiny, squirming body. Everything stopped. The puppy didn't scream. There was no thrashing, no desperate attempt to break free. Just a soft, limp sag of fur between Cutter's jaws like a broken toy. Time stilled. Jonas's heart cracked open, but his body didn't stop. He surged forward, gripping the long steel feeding pole he always carried. It was meant for demonstrations, for guiding rather than striking. But now it was a weapon, and it felt like the only thing left between life and death. He didn't aim for the gator's skull. It was too tough, too armored. Instead, with every ounce of fury and desperation he had, he brought the metal rod down on Cutter's snout hard. The shock of impact jolted up his arms, ringing his bones like a bell. Cutter hissed an explosive burst of air that echoed across the pond, and for a second, just a second, his jaws loosened. Jonas didn't hesitate. He jammed the pole into the open mouth, wedging it against the back of the gator's throat, and with his free hand, he reached forward and grabbed the limp, wet body. It was heavier than he expected. Waterlogged, bloodied, but whole. Cutter thrashed furious, but Jonas was already stumbling backward, the puppy pressed tight to his chest. He slipped once in the mud, nearly falling, but didn't stop until he was back on the wooden platform, falling to his knees with the pup still cradled in his arms. Delaney was already at his side. Her eyes were wide with shock, her hand clutching his shoulder. Jonas, oh my God. But he wasn't listening. His focus was locked on the tiny form in his arms. The puppy wasn't moving. Its fur, once a soft golden tan, was now matted with dark streaks of blood. Bite marks along the ribs leaked slow, deep crimson. The eyes were closed. The chest didn't rise. Jonas whispered, "Come on, stay with me." He laid the puppy down gently on the warm wooden slats of the platform and pressed 2 fingers to its sternum. Tiny compressions, steady and fast. 1, 2, 3, again. A whisper of breath into the tiny mouth. Again. Behind him, someone was calling for help. A siren far off, maybe. But he only saw the puppy, only felt the weight of it under his hands. He pumped again and again. And then a twitch, a cough, a gurgle. Water and blood spilled from the pup's mouth, and the chest hitched once. Then again. Jonas let out a shaky breath. "He's breathing," he said, barely a whisper. Delaney pressed a towel into his hands, and together they wrapped the tiny body. Jonas looked up, and that's when he saw it, the other puppy. Milo, standing just beyond the platform, wet and trembling, looking straight at him. Somehow the second one had made it to the edge of the pond. Alone. Alive. Jonas reached out, and Milo staggered forward, tail tucked, ears flat, but eyes wide and fixed on Jonas. The pup collapsed beside his brother, pressing his tiny head against the other's flank. Jonas gathered them both. He didn't speak. He didn't think. He just moved, through the crowd of silent, stunned tourists, past the gates of the sanctuary, into the emergency vet wing where fluorescent lights hummed and antiseptic clung to the air. He didn't stop until he reached the back room where Marisol stood, waiting, already snapping on gloves. "What happened?" she asked, her voice firm, her eyes already scanning the injured pup. "A woman," Jonas said, barely able to say the words. "She threw them." Marisol's hands froze for a second. Her face tightened. "She what?" "She threw them into the gator pond," he said. "Cutter got one of them. This one." She didn't speak again, just moved, swift, practiced, deliberate. Jonas backed into the wall, the second puppy still in his arms, watching as the team worked. Fluids were connected, wounds cleaned, oxygen administered. The room was full of motion urgency and the low murmur of medical terms. But for Jonas, the world had narrowed to the soft, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, and the warmth of the small body curled in his lap, the puppy who had survived but hadn't yet stopped shaking. Outside, the sun still shone on the cypress trees and the still waters of the pond. But inside that room, everything had changed. A decision had been made without words. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. And as Jonas sat there, eyes never leaving the trembling form on the table, he didn't yet know the names they would carry. He didn't yet know the long road of healing ahead. But he did know one thing. They were alive. And as the beeping continued steady and fragile, one of the puppies moved just slightly and opened one eye. A single glassy blink, And then, the eye turned toward him. And somewhere deep in that gaze, beneath the pain, beneath the fear, there was something else beginning to stir. The fluorescent lights in the Cypress Grove veterinary clinic cast a pale, unwavering glow across the stainless steel countertops and white-tiled floors, creating an atmosphere that felt sterile and unforgiving. Yet, in that moment, with two broken puppies stretched out on exam tables and the metallic tang of blood heavy in the air, the room pulsed with something raw, something desperate, the unrelenting fight to keep life from slipping away. Jonas stood with his shirt soaked through mud, still drying in streaks along his forearms and pants, while Delaney moved quickly at his side, unwrapping gauze and snapping open sterile packs with practiced urgency. The smaller puppy, the one who had nearly drowned, lay curled and trembling in the towel Jonas had wrapped around him. The other, the one Cutter had clamped in his jaws, lay stretched on the table motionless, his fur dark with drying blood and swamp water, his breathing so shallow it barely lifted the thin white cloth beneath him. Marisol Reyes had been the sanctuary's lead veterinarian for almost a decade. She was known for her calm, steady hands, for her unflinching resolve in emergencies, and for a heart that beat fiercely beneath the surface of her clinical precision. But as she leaned over the wounded pup, her brow furrowed and her lips pressed into a tight line, there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed the weight of the moment. "Delaney, I need IV fluids now." Jonas held him steady gently. His abdomen is distended. There may be internal bleeding. Jonas nodded wordlessly, placing one hand near the pup's head and the other just behind his front legs. The skin felt unnaturally cold, the breath rising in tiny, uneven hitches. The puppy's mouth was half open, his tongue dull and dry. His eyes were closed and his body gave no sign of awareness, no twitch of pain or resistance. Marisol pressed a stethoscope to the pup's chest, moving it slowly. Heartbeat is irregular, weak, pupils unresponsive. He's in shock, deep shock. Jonas swallowed hard. "Can you save him?" Her hands didn't stop moving. "We'll try." Delaney returned with the IV bag already primed. Marisol slid the needle into a vein, as fine as a thread, the pup's leg, barely thicker than a branch. Clear fluid began its slow drip down the line, warmth, hydration, hope. Then came the antibiotics, and then the warming blanket hastily pulled from the cabinet and spread over his limp form. Marisol cleaned the wounds next, wincing slightly as she peeled away the blood-matted fur to reveal the full extent of the damage. 4 punctures deep and jagged curved around his left side like a half-moon, the signature of Cutter's bite. One of them oozed bright red when touched. A bad sign. "We need to get an ultrasound," she said. "If his lung's been perforated, we're in serious trouble." But there was no time to move him now. Not when his pulse was this unstable. Not when each second away from warmth and stillness could tip the balance. So they stayed hunched over him, whispering commands, watching numbers, listening for rhythm. Jonas held the warming pad in place with one hand and adjusted the oxygen mask with the other. Delaney kept the supplies coming. Marisol worked in silence, her eyes sharp, her every breath a calculation. In the corner of the room, the second puppy, the one they had started calling Milo, though no name had yet been spoken aloud, lay on a blanket in a kennel with the door open. He didn't move. He didn't whine. He didn't look around. He just lay there, eyes wide but empty, as if whatever had allowed him to survive had retreated deep inside him and left only the shell. Jonas kept glancing over at him, feeling the ache grow deeper each time. "You're doing great, buddy," he whispered, even though Milo didn't react. "You made it through the worst of it." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. The clinic smelled like antiseptic, and beneath it was the undeniable scent of blood, metallic earthy, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. Jonas had been in this room countless times before. He'd held owls with broken wings, bobcats, with fractured legs, raccoons poisoned by garbage. He'd learned the difference between pain and panic, between injury and defeat. But he had never felt this helpless. Marisol finished stitching one of the wounds, her gloved fingers moving quickly and cleanly. "We stabilized the worst puncture," she said, "but I still need to check for internal fluid. I need him conscious for that." Jonas looked down at the puppy's face. It was small, perfect, in the way baby animals always are rounded. Knout's soft ears too big for his head, fur damp and clinging to the contours of fragile ribs. There was a kind of silence in that face that frightened Jonas more than any scream. "He hasn't made a sound," Jonas said quietly. "Not since I pulled him out." Marisol nodded. "That's normal. This kind of shock. The brain just shuts down. He's gone into preservation mode." Jonas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He glanced again toward Milo. The puppy was still curled unmoving, staring at the wall. He looked smaller than he had on the dock, as though the fear had made him fold inward. A tiny wet comma punctuating the sentence none of them were ready to write. "I don't know what I'm doing," Jonas said suddenly. "I've been doing this job for years and I thought I was strong enough to see anything. But this feels different." Marisol didn't look up. "That's because it is," she replied. "This isn't just a rescue. This was meant to be an execution. And you walked into it and said no." Jonas closed his eyes for a second. He hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't let himself. There had been no time to process, only motion, only instinct. The splash, the flash of Cutter's eyes, the weight of the puppy in his arms. But now, standing still, he realized the enormity of it. Not just the act, but the aftermath. These were lives interrupted. Futures rewritten in a matter of seconds. And somehow it had fallen to him to make sense of the wreckage. Delaney stepped closer, her voice soft. "Do you want me to stay with Milo? You should get some rest." Jonas shook his head. "I can't leave. Not yet. Not until I know." He reached down gently, brushing a finger along the pup's paw. "You've got to fight, little guy," he whispered. "You're not alone. You hear me?" The heart monitor gave a single loud beep. Marisol's head snapped up, then another, and then the steady rhythm began to tick again, faint but consistent. The numbers began to climb. Temperature rising, pulse evening out, respiration ragged but improving. Marisol exhaled and looked at Jonas. "We've got him back for now." Jonas nodded slowly. His hands trembled as he reached for a blanket, wrapping it loosely around the pup's fragile form. He didn't even realize he was crying until Delaney gently pressed a tissue into his hand. And still, Milo hadn't moved. Jonas turned and knelt beside the kennel, opening the door wider. Milo flinched, but didn't retreat. "Hey, buddy," Jonas murmured. "Your friend's still here. He's fighting. Maybe you can too." He didn't push. He didn't reach in. He just sat there, close enough for warmth, but far enough for choice. For minutes, there was no change. And then the tiniest shift. Milo's nose twitched. His eyes flicked toward Jonas, then toward the table. A pause. Then slowly, painfully slowly, the little pup lifted his head and let out a barely audible breath. Jonas smiled through the blur of exhaustion and relief. "Yeah," he said. "That's it. You're still in there." Outside, the storm clouds that had threatened all morning had finally gathered. A low rumble echoed in the distance, promising rain. But inside the clinic, beneath the buzz of machines and the hum of fluorescent light, something fragile had been reignited, not just the flicker of a heartbeat, not just the breath in a battered chest, but a thread, a connection. And as Jonas leaned back against the wall, his legs numb, his eyes heavy, He looked again at the table where the wounded pup, still unnamed, stirred beneath the warming blanket. And for the first time, one small paw shifted, reaching outward, just enough to brush the edge of Jonas's hand. And in that touch, there was something unmistakable, the beginning of something that neither of them yet had words for. The clinic in the early morning hours felt like a world suspended outside of time. Rain had come quietly in the night, tapping gently on the windows and softening the edges of everything. The fluorescent light, the antiseptic smells, the steady beeping of monitors. It was a hushed, liminal space where every breath felt tentative and every moment stretched long and uncertain. Ash and Milo had survived the night. That simple truth was a small miracle in itself. Marisol had stayed until well past midnight, running blood work, monitoring vitals, keeping her hands steady, even as her voice dropped to a whisper. Delaney came back at dawn, with clean blankets and strong coffee, her presence warm and grounding. But Jonas hadn't left. He was still in the same clothes, still barefoot from discarding his soaked boots, and still sitting on the tile floor between the exam table and the open kennel, one hand near Ash's limp paw, and the other resting lightly against Milo's side. His back ached. His neck was stiff. But he didn't move. Because Ash hadn't moved. Not really. The little German shepherd lay swaddled in a blanket on a padded surface, a heating pad tucked beneath him, an IV line trailing from his leg like a thread of life itself. His fur, once soft and thick, was still matted in places, dulled with dried blood. The wounds along his rib cage had been cleaned and stitched, but the deep bruising underneath turned his side into a dark, mottled shadow. His breathing was faint, shallow, the kind of breath you had to lean in close to notice. And his eyes never opened. Jonas had started counting the tiny twitches, a flicker in the back leg, a flutter beneath the eyelid, like they were stars in a night sky. Signs, promises, anything to hold on to. But the truth was, Ash was lost in some distant place unreachable by hands or voice. Milo, on the other hand, had begun to return slowly, cautiously, as if testing the temperature of a world that had tried to drown him. He had curled against Jonas at some point during the night, his damp little body trembling in his sleep, letting out faint sighs, as if still unsure whether this new safety was real or just another cruel mirage. But when morning broke and light filtered through the blinds, he'd lifted his head. He'd sniffed the air. He'd looked at Jonas with eyes that, while still shadowed with fear, held something else, recognition. Jonas hadn't spoken much. Words felt clumsy, too loud for a room full of wounds. Instead, he let his presence be his offering. He adjusted the blanket when it slipped. He made sure the IV bag didn't tangle. He held his breath every time Ash twitched and whispered quiet encouragements that didn't need to be heard to matter. Still here, he'd murmur, "You're still here." They'd chosen the names the night before while Marisol cleaned instruments and Delaney updated charts. Ash Jonas said softly, looking at the more injured pup, "Because he came out of the fire." And Milo Delaney asked, "Because he stayed." There was no ceremony in the naming, but the moment still carried weight. Naming something made it real. It meant you saw it. You claimed it. You were willing to stand beside it. Now, in the stillness of morning, Jonas watched as Milo shifted slightly and rested his chin on his own front paw, his ears twitching every time Ash let out a shallow exhale. The bond between them was silent, but visible, an invisible thread, connecting two souls broken in the same moment. Jonas leaned his head back against the wall and exhaled slowly. He had always believed in resilience. Nature had taught him that the way trees could grow around barbed wire, the way injured owls could relearn flight, the way life always tried to keep going, even in the worst conditions. But this was something different. This wasn't just about injury or survival. This was about trust. And Ash had none left. Milo, at least, had begun to respond to touch. When Jonas gently ran a finger between his ears, the puppy no longer flinched. He didn't lean in, not yet, but he accepted the contact. He blinked. He followed movement. He trembled less with each hour. The fear was still there, but it had edges now, boundaries. Ash, though, remained locked inside himself. Marisol entered just after 7, hair tied up in a loose bun, a coffee thermos in one hand and a tablet in the other. Her expression was tired but sharp. She knelt beside Ash, checked the IV, listened to his chest, felt the stitches gently with 2 fingers. "No fever," she said quietly. "That's good. No fluid buildup in the abdomen yet. That's even better." Jonas didn't speak, just watched her face. "But..." She hesitated. "But he's not responsive." She looked up at Jonas. "He's surviving because we're keeping him alive. His body is doing the minimum, but his mind, he's hiding deep." Jonas nodded, swallowing against the lump rising in his throat. "I don't know how to reach him," he said. "I've tried touch, voice, warmth. It's like he's gone." Marisol sat back on her heels. "I've seen this before. In dogs who've been through fire rescues and animals pulled from hoarding houses. Sometimes it's not about what they lost. It's about what they stopped believing in." Jonas looked down at Ash, so small and still under the warming blanket. "And what do we do?" She set her thermos on the floor and placed a gentle hand on Jonas's shoulder. "We wait. We don't give up. And when the time is right, we offer him something he can choose to come back to." Jonas nodded, the weight of those words settling over him like a second skin. The hours passed in small motions. Delaney brought food, though neither Jonas nor the dogs touched it. Marisol returned to her rounds. Rain drizzled against the windows, soft and rhythmic. Milo eventually stood and walked 3 hesitant steps toward Jonas's outstretched hand, then curled against his leg again, as if declaring this spot, this man, was now his. But Ash remained unmoving. By late afternoon, Jonas shifted onto the floor beside the table, resting his head on folded arms just inches from Ash's paw. He let himself drift, not quite sleeping, but slipping into the liminal space between thoughts. His heartbeat slowed. The machines hummed. And then a change. It was small. So small he thought he imagined it at first. A breath slightly deeper. A paw flexing the tiniest curl of movement. Jonas sat up, heart racing. He leaned in close, watching. Ash's eyes were still closed, but his ears. One of them had twitched. Not in reflex, in recognition. "Marisol," he called barely above a whisper. He moved. She was at his side in seconds, stethoscope out, listening, measuring, watching. Her expression remained neutral, but Jonas saw the light in her eyes. He's stabilizing. His pressure's better. That twitch that was voluntary. Jonas looked down, his throat tight. He's still in there. Marisol nodded slowly. "Yes. And now, we just have to give him a reason to come out." That night, as the rain eased and the world outside began to cool under the approach of evening, Jonas stayed in the clinic again. He brought in a pillow from the volunteer lounge, folded himself onto the floor beside the 2 pups, and let the silence hold them all. He didn't speak. He didn't coax. He just stayed, breathing slow, hand resting near the corner of Ash's blanket, fingers gently touching the warmth that pulsed there. And somewhere deep in the quiet, in the hush that follows survival, but comes before healing, Ash's paw shifted again. This time, it stayed close. And Jonas, though barely awake, felt it the faintest weight against his wrist, like a tether reattaching itself in the dark. The soft hum of the clinic's heating system had become a kind of heartbeat in the background, a steady thrum that kept time with the quiet lives unfolding on the floor beneath the overhead lights. Outside, the skies over Cypress Grove had turned slate gray, and a fog rolled in through the cypress knees, and Spanish moss muffling even the calls of the herons. Inside, everything felt still, suspended, tender. Ash remained wrapped in a cocoon of silence. Though his vital signs had stabilized and the worst of the infection had been held at bay, the small German shepherd continued to lie motionless on his padded bed, flinching only when startled, shrinking from touch, hiding in plain sight. The most fragile part of him wasn't the body anymore. It was the soul that refused to return to the surface. Jonas knew this kind of quiet wasn't peace, it was retreat. So he started trying, not in the frantic fix-it way of someone who wanted to force healing, but in the slow, patient rhythm of someone who had learned that connection grows in the spaces between effort and presence. The first thing he brought was a soft towel, one that had been warmed in the dryer and smelled faintly of cedarwood from the staff laundry room. He gently folded it over Ash's back, not enough to restrain, just enough to offer pressure, the kind that simulated a mother's body, the kind that said, "You're not floating. You're here. You're held." Ash didn't respond. Not with a twitch, not with a sigh. But he didn't reject it either. It was a beginning. Next, Jonas began to speak. He didn't tell stories in the traditional sense. He spoke about little things, about the turtle he'd found in the sanctuary garden last spring, about how Milo was starting to sniff the edges of the room without flinching, about the time a deer had wandered into the gift shop and knocked over a shelf of plush toys. He told these stories not because he expected understanding, but because the sound of a voice, calm, steady, human, was something the world had taken from Ash. Jonas meant to give it back. Then came music, soft classical tracks played from his old phone speaker, piano etudes, acoustic guitar lullabies, instrumentals with no voices to startle. The melodies filled the space like warm light, coating the edges of the clinic in something gentle. Milo seemed to respond. First, his head would lift when the music began, ears pricking slightly, eyes softening. He'd nudge closer to Ash when the music slowed sometimes, resting his chin on the blanket that covered his friend's side. But Ash remained still, present but unreachable. Jonas wasn't deterred. Each day he tried something new, always with the same intention to offer safety in a form that Ash could choose to accept or not. It was on the fourth day that he remembered the plush toy. In the sanctuary's tiny gift shop, nestled between magnets and guidebooks, there was a display of stuffed animals, most of them swamp-themed. Frogs, cranes, manatees. But Jonas had seen a crocodile one once, with button eyes and a wide, cartoonish smile. It wasn't gory. It wasn't sharp. It was silly, soft, oddly lovable. He walked there in the afternoon, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and picked it off the shelf. The irony wasn't lost on him, offering a crocodile-shaped toy to a puppy mauled by a gator. But something in his gut told him to trust the instinct. This wasn't a joke. This was a symbol. A way to rewrite the story. Back in the clinic, he walked over to Ash's bed and knelt down slowly, holding the toy like an offering. Milo lifted his head first, his eyes flicking between Jonas and the plush croc. Jonas smiled. "You remember this guy?" He set the toy on the blanket just in front of Ash's nose. Then he leaned back and waited. Minutes passed. Milo inched forward, gave the toy a cautious sniff, then looked at Ash and laid back down beside him, closer this time, almost touching. Ash didn't move. The room was still. The music played quietly. Outside, the wind began to shift. And then, without warning, Ash's nose twitched. Just once. Jonas didn't breathe. The twitch came again, a small, uncertain motion, and then slowly, Ash stretched his head forward by half an inch and touched the plush toy with the tip of his nose. It wasn't a paw. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a sound. But it was his first voluntary movement. Jonas felt something deep in his chest crack open, something that had been locked in place for days. His throat tightened. He blinked back the emotion that came rushing in too fast. "That's it," he whispered. "That's all I needed, buddy. That's everything." Ash didn't move again. He didn't repeat the gesture, but he also didn't pull away. Milo, sensing something had shifted, stood up and circled his friend once, then laid back down with a heavy sigh. His body pressed lightly against Ash's side. He stretched his neck forward and gave Ash a slow, deliberate lick across the ear. Not urgent, not playful, but purposeful. A signal. You're not alone. From that night on, Milo became more than a fellow survivor. He became a quiet guardian. When Ash trembled in his sleep, which still happened especially when the wind howled or when thunder rolled in the distance, Milo would shift closer sometimes, curling himself like a comma around Ash's spine. His body acted like a brace, like a promise. He never barked. He never left the bed unless Jonas lifted him out for food or water. He stayed. And Ash, though still locked in a world of silence, began to show tiny changes. He no longer flinched at gentle touch. His breath no longer hitched when footsteps approached. His paw, once stiff and unresponsive, now twitched in sleep. Jonas knew the road ahead was still long. Trauma didn't unwind itself in days. Fear didn't vanish just because love showed up at the door. But something essential had happened. Ash had made a choice. He had moved towards something, even if just a toy, even if just for a second. He had reached out. Jonas spent the rest of that week re-establishing rhythm. He fed Milo by hand, letting him sniff each piece of food, making the act of eating feel like a reward instead of a task. He dabbed Ash's wounds with a cloth soaked in warm saline, murmuring nonsense with every touch. He let the music play constantly, changing the playlists according to the time of day. Cheerful guitar in the morning, slower strings at night. He wrote their names on the whiteboard above their beds. Ash. 10 weeks, survivor Milo. 10 weeks, guardian. Marisol came in once a day to check progress, to change dressings, to run new vitals. But even she started to step more quietly, to speak more gently, as if the room had transformed into something sacred. One evening, as the light slanted golden through the blinds and the cypress trees outside swayed in the breeze, Jonas sat on the floor beside the bed. His legs stretched out in front of him, Milo's head resting on his foot. Ash had not moved much since the day of the plush toy. But tonight, as the music played and Jonas read aloud from an old animal care manual, just to fill the silence, Ash stirred. Not just a twitch this time. He opened one eye just a crack and blinked. Then he turned his head toward the sound of Jonas's voice and exhaled a soft breath that seemed to carry months of fear and confusion in its wake. Jonas didn't speak. He just smiled, eyes shining. Because it was happening. The light was returning not in a burst, but in flickers. And in those flickers, Jonas saw the truth. Ash wasn't just healing, he was deciding. And as the room fell quiet once more, that small stuffed crocodile sat nestled between the two puppies, no longer a monster, but a marker of the moment when the darkness began to shift. It began in the quietest moment, the kind of moment so ordinary, you wouldn't expect it to hold anything special, just Jonas sitting cross-legged on the clinic floor, a paper plate balanced on his knee, steam rising from shredded chicken, still warm from the staff kitchen. Milo sat beside him, eyes wide and fixed on every movement tail, giving small, uncertain sways across the tile like a brushstroke in rhythm with hope. Jonas tore a strip of meat in half and laid it down just inches from Milo's paws. "Good boy." He murmured the words, light as breath. "You're doing great." Milo leaned forward, gave the morsel a cautious sniff, then picked it up delicately with his teeth. He didn't chew immediately, just held it there, head tilted slightly, as though asking permission from a world that had once been cruel. Then he swallowed. Jonas smiled, his voice a little warmer this time. "That's my guy. Each meal since their rescue had been a slow ceremony, especially for Milo, who had once refused even broth. But now, with Jonas offering each piece, gently murmuring encouragements between bites, Milo had begun to associate mealtime not with survival, but with comfort, with connection. His movements, once jittery and abrupt, had softened. He no longer cowered at the clatter of a dropped spoon, and though he still flinched at loud shoes or distant thunder, he returned more quickly to Jonas's side, pressing his small body against the man's knee, as if to say, "I know this is where safety lives." Ash, however, was still distant present in body, but unreachable in spirit. He lay on his bed like a carved shape of himself. Eyes open but unfocused, breath steady but disconnected. The plush crocodile toy still sat near his chest, and Milo still curled close each night, often stretching one paw over Ash's flank like a barrier, or maybe a tether. But then came the morning when something changed. Jonas had just begun the ritual, laying out a line of small chicken pieces along the floor, spaced like stepping stones, leading toward him when Ash stirred. Not the shallow twitches of sleep or pain, but a deliberate, uncertain movement of his front paw. A shift of weight so minimal it might have gone unnoticed had Jonas not been watching with the intensity of someone hoping for miracles. He froze. "Ash," he whispered. The pup's ears twitched slightly at the sound, but his eyes remained downcast. Jonas didn't move. He waited. Ash's paw slid forward again, this time paired with the slow, trembling effort of his body trying to follow. His back legs pushed gently against the bedding. His body trembled with the effort. Every muscle seemed to be working against itself, weak from days of stillness, unsure whether the movement was worth the cost. But he kept going. Milo lifted his head, eyes wide, ears perked. He didn't move, didn't interfere, just watched as his friend the pup, who had spent every hour frozen in a silence too deep to reach, inched forward onto shaky legs. Jonas's breath caught as Ash rose, wobbling hindquarters, sagging front legs planted too close together. He looked like he might collapse under the weight of himself. But he didn't. He stayed upright. And then, with a motion that seemed to steal all the strength he had left, Ash lifted one paw and took a step. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even stable. But it was a step. Jonas felt something warm rise in his chest, an emotion so large it seemed to press against his ribs. He lowered his voice even more, making his tone soft as linen. "Ash? Hey, buddy." Ash's head turned slightly slowly, like a door creaking open for the first time in years. Then, for the first time, his eyes met Jonas's. There was no light in them yet, not fully. But there was a flicker of awareness, a shimmer of something human in a place that had been hollow. Jonas swallowed his voice thick. "There you are." Ash didn't move again, not that day. The single step had drained him, and he collapsed gently onto the floor, curling into himself in a slow-motion fall that ended with his head resting beside Milo's outstretched paw. But the gaze had stayed. That brief, weightless lock of eyes, fragile but real, had left something in its wake. It was enough. The days that followed were stitched together with small victories, each one barely noticeable to someone who hadn't watched these puppies exist in the throes of trauma. But for Jonas, each movement was a firework, subtle but spectacular. Ash began to push himself up once a day, sometimes twice. He'd lift his head when Jonas entered the room. He started sniffing the food plate, though he still wouldn't eat on his own. Jonas remained consistent, gentle routines, soft praise, a rhythm of care that never faltered. He read aloud in the afternoon, sometimes from old field journals, sometimes from emails printed out on crumpled paper. His voice filled the room in a way that didn't demand attention, but invited it. Milo followed him everywhere, now a small, silent shadow. When Jonas swept the floor, Milo was at his heel. When Jonas filled the water bowls, Milo watched every pour like it was sacred. And at night, when Jonas dimmed the lights and laid a blanket near the pups, Milo would always return to Ash's side, curling tightly against him, sometimes resting his head on Ash's shoulder in a kind of canine embrace. It was Milo who anchored Ash to the present, and it was Jonas who patiently reminded them both what kindness looked like. It was a Tuesday. Jonas only knew because of the rotation schedule posted outside the clinic when Ash took his second real walk. Jonas had laid out the familiar chicken trail, but this time Ash didn't wait for the smell to come to him. He stood. He wobbled. He walked. Each step was unsteady, his back legs not quite syncing with the front, but his body held itself together, trembling but determined. Jonas didn't speak at first. He didn't want to break the moment. Ash made it halfway down the row of chicken bites before stopping. He looked up, breath shallow sides heaving, and saw Jonas kneeling at the end. Then something unexpected happened. Ash's tail moved. Not a full wag, not yet, but a twitch. A brief, tentative arc through the air like the punctuation at the end of a whispered sentence. Jonas's eyes burned with tears. He opened his arms gently. "Come on, Ash," he said. "Just a little more." And Ash, as if understanding not the words but the tone, stepped forward again. 2 more steps, then 1. Until at last he was close enough to press his nose into Jonas's palm. And when he did, his body crumpled gently into Jonas's lap, exhausted, but safe. Milo bounded forward, then full of excitement, nudging his friend and licking his cheek, his own tail now a blur of motion. The 2 pups curled up together beside Jonas, their chests rising and falling in sync, the healing still fragile but no longer out of reach. That night, as the sky outside turned lavender and the sanctuary lights flickered on like lanterns, guiding the dusk, Jonas sat with both puppies curled against him. He didn't need music. He didn't need to read aloud. The silence had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of pain. It was the silence of rest. And as Ash slept, his nose still nestled against Jonas's hand, a sound so small it almost went unheard, filled the room, a sigh, a real, honest sigh. The kind that comes when the body finally believes it might be safe. Jonas leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closed, his hand resting lightly over both pups. He didn't know what would come next. But in that moment, surrounded by warmth and breath and the faint scent of cedarwood from the blanket, he knew they had crossed a threshold. The darkness still lingered behind them, heavy and real. But ahead, for the first time, there was space. And the next morning, as Jonas reached for the chicken plate again, Ash didn't wait to be coaxed. He was already on his feet, looking up, ready for something new. It began as a whisper, a distant rumble tucked into the horizon, the kind of low growl that slips between the branches of cypress trees and stirs the long draping moss. The evening had been calm, even tender, with soft golden light pooling on the clinic floor and the smell of warmed broth lingering in the air. Jonas was just finishing his notes for the day, his pen scratching across the pages of a well-worn notebook, when the lights flickered once, then held steady. Outside, the Florida sky darkened into a bruised purple, and the first drops of rain tapped faintly against the glass. Inside, the silence shifted. Milo had been dozing under the examination table paws, twitching in a half-dream while Ash curled near Jonas's chair, his head resting on a rolled-up towel like it was the most precious thing in the world. Ash had come far from stillness to movement, from dissociation to faint wagging. He still flinched at abrupt sounds, still hesitated before reaching for food, but the haze had lifted. There was presence in his eyes now, even curiosity. Jonas looked at both of them and smiled. "You 2 are starting to act like real puppies," he said softly. And then the sky cracked. It wasn't a subtle thunderclap. It was a violent, bone-deep explosion of sound that slammed into the building with such ferocity that the window panes rattled in their frames. The power hiccuped, the overhead lights dimming before struggling back to life. In an instant, everything changed. Milo bolted upright with a sharp yelp, his body stiff with terror. Without hesitation, he scrambled toward the darkest place he could find, a narrow space under the metal desk. His limbs uncoordinated, his nails scrabbling against the tile as if the floor itself had betrayed him. Ash froze. His eyes widened, ears pinned flat against his skull, and then for the first time, he made a sound. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a whine. It was a raw, high-pitched whimper, torn from somewhere deep inside, a trembling, wounded sound that vibrated with fear too old for his short life. And then, with an urgency that made Jonas's heart clench, Ash turned and ran, not away from the noise, but toward Jonas. Jonas barely had time to react before the puppy collided with him, his small body trembling as he buried himself into the crook of Jonas's arm, pushing and pressing and climbing like he couldn't get close enough. Jonas dropped his notebook, both arms coming around the pup, instinctively gathering him, and feeling the hammering heartbeat against his chest. Ash didn't stop shaking. He pressed his face into Jonas's shirt paws, clawing at his side ribs, expanding in panicked, uneven gasps. Another roll of thunder boomed overhead, longer this time, as if the sky was slowly splitting apart. From beneath the desk, Milo cried out again, a sharp, desperate sound. Jonas reached out with one arm, his hand brushing against the cool floor until it found Milo's shoulder. Hey, it's okay, he said, his voice calm but firm. Come here, buddy. Milo didn't move at first. He was crouched, every muscle locked, eyes wide and rimmed with white. Another flash lit the room, lightning this time brilliant and brief. Jonas didn't call again. He just waited, his arms still outstretched, one hand cradling Ash close, the other open and steady, a silent invitation. Then, after a moment, Milo crept forward. His crawl was slow and shaky, his body low to the ground. But he moved one paw, then another, until he reached Jonas's lap. And when he did, he didn't hesitate. He collapsed into the open space between Ash and Jonas, curling against them both, his body flush with trembling energy, his breath quick and shallow. Jonas gathered them both. He shifted to the floor, fully sitting against the base of the wall, legs stretched out, back aching, but arms strong. He wrapped them tight around the two small bodies in his lap, Ash on the left, Milo on the right, and pulled the edge of a blanket over all three of them like a shelter. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Rain lashed the windows, now hard and fast. The thunder was nearly constant, deep groans that seemed to shake the very bones of the building. The wind howled through the cracks, and the old fluorescent light flickered again, casting shadows that danced across the walls. But inside that blanket, inside that circle of warmth and trust and breath, there was stillness. Ash had stopped whimpering. Milo had stopped panting. Jonas could feel their chests rise and fall beneath his hands, still uneven, but sinking slowly into something steadier. He spoke again, not in full sentences, just fragments, soft sounds, the kind of voice you use with a baby afraid of the dark. You're safe. I've got you. No more thunder's gonna touch you here. Neither dog moved, but both listened. He could feel it, the small shifts of muscle, the slight leaning in the way Milo's head pressed harder against his arm, and Ash's paw curled unconsciously over his leg. They weren't just enduring the storm anymore. They were enduring it together. Jonas sat there for what felt like hours, his body growing numb, his back sore against the wall. But he didn't care. He didn't move. He didn't want to risk breaking whatever spell had settled over them. This wasn't just about fear anymore. This was about choice. Ash, the puppy who had once curled into himself so tightly he'd seemed to vanish, had chosen to run toward him. Milo, who once cowered at every noise, had returned from his hiding place, not out of instinct, but out of trust. They had chosen him not because he was the strongest, not because he had all the answers, but because when the world had shaken them to their core, his arms had become the only place that made sense. It was more than healing. It was bond. And bonds forged in fear and shared silence. In moments where breath and presence were the only anchors, those were the ones that held. Eventually, the thunder began to fade. The sky calmed, the rain softened, the lights steadied. Jonas let out a long breath and looked down. Ash was asleep. His body was no longer rigid. His face had softened lips twitching gently in some dreamless surrender. Milo's eyes were open but heavy. He blinked slowly, head still pressed against Jonas's chest, and gave a quiet, almost inaudible sigh. Jonas stroked both their backs with the same hand, slow, even motions. "Good boys," he said. No more than that. He stayed on the floor long after the last drops of rain had vanished, even as the moon pushed through the clouds and cast soft light across the now silent clinic. In the days to come, they would remember this night, not for its fear, but for what had happened in the fear. Ash would begin to follow Jonas, not just with his eyes, but with his feet. Milo would bark for the first time just once at a paper towel roll that startled him, and both would return to this lap, again and again, not because they were scared, but because they had learned that some hearts become home. And in the stillness that followed the storm, as the three of them sat, wrapped in warmth and trust, Jonas looked down and whispered a promise he didn't yet know how to keep, but knew he'd never break. The morning sunlight filtered through the high branches of the cypress trees, turning the dew on the blades of grass into a blanket of silver. Behind the clinic, in a small patch of fenced-in lawn that had gone mostly unused over the years, the world felt softer, quieter, like it had been set aside just for them. Jonas stood in the middle of the yard, the toes of his boots damp, a red rubber ball cupped gently in his hand. It was scuffed and slightly lopsided, the kind of toy that had rolled beneath too many cabinets and been chewed at both ends. But in his palm, it felt like something sacred. Behind him, Ash and Milo hovered at the edge of the patio, hesitant, wide-eyed, unsure of what came next. It was their first time beyond the walls of the clinic since the day their lives had been rewritten. The door had been left open. The sky was clear. The wind carried only the soft scent of damp earth and far-off pine. Nothing threatening, nothing loud. And yet both pups remained just shy of the threshold, their paws pressed against the warm tile as if the grass were a mystery they couldn't yet name. Jonas didn't speak. He simply turned his back to them, crouched low, and placed the ball on the grass with the gentleness of someone setting down a newborn. Then he gave it a little push. The red rubber ball wobbled forward a few feet, picking up just enough speed to roll in a lazy curve through the middle of the yard, leaving a faint trail in the dew. He stood and waited. Milo moved first. It was barely more than a shuffle, a tentative step, then a pause, then another. His nose twitched, his ears tilted. He looked at Jonas for reassurance, and when he saw no danger, only patience, he stepped into the grass. It tickled his toes. His legs stiffened for a moment, then softened. He looked toward the ball, now settled in the middle of the lawn, like a question waiting to be answered. Milo moved toward it. Ash remained frozen in the doorway, his body, low ears, flat eyes flickering between Jonas, Milo, and the open space beyond. Jonas turned and crouched again. "Come on, Ash," he said quietly. "There's something good out here." Ash didn't move. Milo reached the ball, nudged it with his nose, then looked back not at Jonas, but at Ash, and gave a soft huff like a whispered invitation. Jonas saw it then, the moment Ash's paw lifted. One step, then another. The motion was stiff, almost mechanical. But it was movement forward toward his brother, toward the toy, toward the unknown. By the time Ash reached the edge of the grass, Milo had already started to push the ball again, more confidently this time, tail swaying just slightly behind him. Jonas backed up, giving them space, sitting down in the grass, cross-legged, watching quietly. Ash sniffed the grass, lifted his head, looked around. Then, with a sudden burst of movement that surprised even himself, he trotted wobbly and crooked toward the ball. Milo paused, letting him catch up. And there, in the center of the yard, with the sun on their backs and the scent of the earth beneath them, something magical happened. Ash barked. Not loud, not strong. It was a short, sharp yip, startled and uncertain. But it was a bark. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. For a second the world blurred. Because that sound, that fragile little noise, was joy trying to find its voice again. Ash looked confused by it, as if surprised that it had come from him. He stared at the ball, then at Milo, then back to Jonas, and then slowly, wonderfully, his tail moved. A single wag. Jonas laughed, a sound so full it echoed off the brick wall behind the clinic. "That's it," he whispered. "That's my boy." Milo gave the ball another push. Ash pounced all paws and floppy ears and missed by a mile, rolling onto his side in the wet grass with a grunt. But instead of retreating, he got up again. This time he didn't hesitate. He bounded forward and caught the ball between his paws, holding it like treasure, panting lightly, eyes bright. Jonas blinked hard, his hand covering his mouth. The sight of Ash, once curled in silence, once flinching at every sound, now standing in the sunlight with a ball between his teeth, was almost too much. Milo came to stand beside him, nudging the toy once, then twice, until Ash dropped it, and they both batted it across the lawn. What followed wasn't chaos or rough play or loud, joyful barking. It was something smaller. A game played in glances and taps, in slow, deliberate motions. A dance of recovery. They chased the ball back and forth with careful excitement, bumping shoulders, tumbling once or twice, always pausing to check each other, as if learning the rules of play together. Jonas didn't join in. He just watched as Ash pawed the ball and looked up, tail wagging in earnest now. Watched as Milo did a clumsy half-bow, the universal invitation for fun. Watched as the space between fear and freedom narrowed with every pass. They played for 10 minutes, maybe 20. Long enough for the sun to rise a little higher, for the dew to begin to dry. Then, tired but content, both puppies returned to Jonas, climbing into his lap without hesitation. They collapsed against his legs, tongues lolling fur damp with effort and grass. Ash rested his head on Jonas's knee. Milo stretched across both of them like a blanket. Jonas sat in the middle of the lawn, his arms around them both, the red rubber ball lying forgotten a few feet away, no longer just a toy, but a symbol. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Because in that stillness, in the warmth of fur and breath and trust, everything he had hoped for, everything he had fought for, was right there in his arms. For the first time, they weren't surviving. They were living. And tomorrow, he knew they would come out a little faster, run a little farther, bark a little louder, because today they had remembered something vital. They were dogs. And dogs, even broken ones, are born to play. And somewhere just beyond the fence, a butterfly lifted into the air, catching the sunlight as it drifted lazily over the grass, unaware that down below, 3 hearts had just learned how to beat in sync again. The notice came on a Thursday morning, folded neatly into Jonas's inbox, and marked with the subject line, "Adoption listing Ash and Milo." It was short to the point, and signed with the kind of cheerful detachment that often came with official procedure. Please begin preparing bios and evaluation forms. Potential adopters scheduled for next week. Jonas stared at the screen for a long time, the cursor blinking like a pulse in the corner. He'd known this was coming. From the moment the puppies had survived, from the moment their recovery became less about survival and more about growth. The goal had been clear: to find them a home. A forever home. That's what they called it. A place with a yard. a family, a fresh start. But something about the word forever stung now like a promise that might pull them away. Jonas leaned back in his chair and glanced down. Ash and Milo were both sprawled beneath his desk, their limbs tangled in sleep. Milo's ears twitched every so often, catching faint dream sounds. Ash lay curled close, his nose pressed into Jonas's boot like it was the anchor to his whole world. Jonas swallowed hard. They had come so far from blood and panic and trembling silence to this quiet rhythm of shared days and slow trust. Ash now greeted him each morning with a nudge. Milo followed him like a second shadow tail, wagging in soft arcs. They knew when it was time to eat, time to rest, time to wander the yard in clumsy figure eights chasing the red rubber ball. They weren't just recovering. They were becoming. And now, someone else wanted to take that over. The family arrived 3 days later. Jonas had spent the morning grooming the pups as best he could, running a brush over their fur, wiping down their paws, making sure their collars sat just right. He tried to act normal, but his hands trembled more than usual. The family was by all appearances perfect. A mother with warm eyes and a calming voice. A father with a kind smile and the sort of firm posture that suggested both patience and reliability. 2 kids. A girl around 10, a boy, a few years younger, wearing matching sneakers and faces filled with eager wonder. They had driven 3 hours to meet the puppies. They had already been approved for adoption. They had brought their own leash. Jonas met them at the outdoor enclosure behind the clinic. The sun was out, casting soft shadows over the grass, and the air smelled faintly of pine. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice measured. "We're so excited," the mother said gently. "We saw their story online. We couldn't believe it. What they've survived. It's incredible." Jonas nodded. "They've come a long way." He clipped a leash to Milo's collar first. The pup had tensed the moment he saw the strangers, but he didn't bolt. He leaned into Jonas's side, looking up with wide eyes as if to ask what this meant. "It's okay," Jonas whispered. "Just say hello." He led Milo forward slowly, letting the family crouch and hold out their hands. The girl reached first, her fingers outstretched with care. "Hi, puppy," she whispered. Milo sniffed her hand. He didn't wag his tail, but he also didn't retreat. It was a small mercy. Jonas clipped the second leash to Ash's collar. Ash was watching from a distance, already tense ears, pinned body low. The leash hung between them like a fuse. "It's all right, Jonas," murmured, his hand firm but gentle. He took a step forward. Ash followed reluctantly, his body trembling with each inch of movement. But when the boy stepped forward, suddenly holding a soft, squeaky toy and waving it in excitement, the spell broke. Ash panicked. He yelped sharp and frightened and pulled backward with all the force his recovering legs could manage. The leash snapped taut, slipping from Jonas's fingers. Ash bolted in a wide arc, scrambling toward the one thing that felt safe. "Jonas!" He dropped to one knee as Ash slammed into his chest, climbing over his legs, burying his face into his neck, whimpering like a memory had grabbed hold of him and refused to let go. Jonas wrapped both arms around him. "I've got you," he whispered, holding on. The family stood in silence. Milo, who had remained still beside the girl, now backed away slowly and trotted toward Jonas, settling behind his leg. The father stepped forward, kneeling down to their level. His eyes were full of something quiet, not pity, but understanding. "They're not ready," he said softly. Jonas didn't respond. "They're not just rescue dogs," the man continued. "They're yours." Jonas looked up, throat tight. "They trust you," the man said. "They've already found their family." It hit like a stone in the chest, simple, clean, undeniable. Family. Not something you choose on a form, not something you sign off on with a contract and a leash and a smiling photo. Something forged. in silence, in fear, in storms, in nights spent curled together on cold floors. The mother gave a small nod, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "We just wanted them to have love," she said. Jonas found his voice. It cracked on the way out. "They do," he said. "They have it." The family didn't argue. They didn't try to persuade or linger in disappointment. They simply smiled gently with grace and turned to go. And Jonas. He sat in the grass for a long time, holding both dogs close, feeling the weight of something settle into place. Not a burden, but a truth. Ash belonged here. Milo belonged here. And maybe, just maybe, so did he. That night, as the sanctuary grew quiet and the stars stretched above the trees, Jonas lay on a folded blanket in the clinic office, the two pups curled tightly against him. He couldn't imagine the days without them. And now he didn't have to, because that question, the one about family, had been answered, not with words, but with trembling paws, desperate eyes, and the way two broken hearts had stitched themselves to his. The clinic lights buzzed faintly overhead. As Jonas sat at his desk, his elbows resting on a stack of printed forms, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Outside the frosted glass window, the sanctuary was beginning to dim beneath the soft veil of twilight. Crickets chirped from the hedgerows, and the wind rustled lazily through pine needles, but inside his thoughts were anything but calm. Ash and Milo were asleep beneath the desk, pressed close together like two halves of the same breath. They had eaten well that day, even played for a while in the back lot, chasing the red rubber ball through uneven tufts of grass. But as the evening deepened and the world wound down, Jonas found himself tangled in a question he couldn't ignore anymore. What now? They were no longer on the adoption list, no longer temporary residents. But Jonas's apartment lease was still firm. No pets, no exceptions. He couldn't leave them behind. And he couldn't bring them home. The contradiction weighed heavy. He rubbed at his temple eyes, burning from lack of sleep, then reached for his phone and scrolled to the contact labeled Marisol Reyes. His thumb hovered for a second before he tapped call. She answered before the second ring. "Please tell me the boys aren't sick," she said, voice warm with a tired smile. "They're fine," Jonas said, his voice low. "It's me." There was a pause. "You've hit the wall, haven't you?" "I can't take them home," he admitted. "But I can't leave them here either. They've chosen me, Marisol. And I chose them a long time ago." She sighed gently. "Let me call someone. I have an idea." The next day, Delaney pulled Jonas aside during her lunch break, a spark in her eyes. "You know the old ranger's cottage at the back of the property?" she asked, leaning against the clinic's back door frame. "The one that's practically swallowed by palmettos." "The same," she said. "Nobody's lived there since Mr. Hollis retired 3 years ago. It's still structurally sound. Roof's been patched, plumbing works. It's not pretty, but it's livable." Jonas blinked. And Marisol talked to the board," she continued. "They're drafting an agreement. If you're willing to fix it up and use it as your on-site housing, the sanctuary will lease it to you for almost nothing. Condition is the boys become our official animal ambassadors." Jonas didn't speak. He just stood there, stunned, 100 thoughts crashing through his mind like startled birds. Delaney smiled and nudged his shoulder. "You get to stay, and they stay with you." By the following week, the paperwork was done. Jonas signed his name at the bottom of the agreement, with hands that shook slightly, not from doubt but from relief. There were no rules here forbidding dogs, no landlord to convince, no pleading or pet deposits, just a gate, a key, and a place to make real what had already become true in his heart. The cottage stood tucked between two ancient cypress trees, moss-draped limbs casting long, delicate shadows across the front porch. The paint was chipped. The floorboards creaked and the garden had long since surrendered to wild vines. But to Jonas, it looked like a promise. He spent 2 days cleaning sweeping dust, airing out rooms, scrubbing old tiles until they shone pale blue again. The walls were sun-bleached, but the windows opened wide. There was a small fenced yard in the back, the kind that was perfect for morning runs and lazy naps under shade. And finally, when the floors were dry and the walls smelled faintly of lemon soap, he brought them home. Ash and Milo rode in the passenger seat of the sanctuary's old golf cart, their heads poking curiously above the edge of the seat. Jonas drove slowly, letting the tires crunch over the gravel path like a gentle drumbeat. As they pulled up, Milo was the first to jump out, paws hitting the ground with purpose. He darted ahead to the porch tail, up nose twitching. Ash followed with more caution, stepping lightly onto the wooden steps, sniffing the threshold as if it held a secret. Jonas unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Welcome home," he said more to himself than to them. Milo crossed first, making a slow circle through the living room, tail wagging in cautious arcs. Ash stayed back for a beat, then stepped through the doorway, ears forward, body tense, and stopped. He sniffed. He turned once. Then suddenly he gave a low, pleased chuff and flopped sideways onto the floor, right in the center of the room, his legs sprawled in every direction, eyes half-lidded, tongue poking slightly out. Milo, catching the signal, trotted over and did the same, curling beside his brother in a soft heap of fur. Jonas stood in the doorway, heart full, watching them breathe in tandem on the old hardwood floor. No panic, no hesitation. They had arrived. That night, Jonas sat on the porch in an old rocking chair he'd found in the cottage's storage shed. The pups lay at his feet, tails flicking in their sleep paws, twitching now and then. The stars blinked quietly overhead, and the air was filled with the scent of pine needles and warm soil. He looked out at the trees, then down at the 2 small bodies that had taught him more about grace than any human ever had. This place was never meant to be permanent. But then again, neither was pain. And yet, here they were, a man and 2 scarred little souls resting in the quiet kind of joy that comes only after a long, brutal climb. Jonas reached down, brushing a hand gently over Ash's ear, then over Milo's shoulder. "You're home now," he said softly. "And we're staying." Inside the house, the light on the porch cast long shadows across the floor. But none of them looked like ghosts. They looked like beginnings. The days at the ranger's cottage began to take on a rhythm of their own, a cadence built from the gentle beats of ordinary life. Each morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting soft lines across the wooden floor. And Jonas would wake to the sound of paws stretching and claws clicking lightly against the boards. Ash would always be the first to lift his head, blinking slowly at the morning light, while Milo would roll over onto his back, waiting for the warm brush of Jonas's hand against his chest before moving an inch. They were still healing. Ash would avoid the sound of running water, tensing. When Jonas filled the small garden tub with a hose, his body stiff like a bowstring. His memories of that gator pond lived in the way he refused to approach anything that smelled of dampness or echoed with splashes. Milo, on the other hand, would startle at the sharp cry of a distant siren or the honk of a car horn from the highway that bordered the sanctuary. He would dart toward the door or press himself against Jonas's legs until the sound faded into silence. But even with these fears, each day brought a step forward. Jonas had learned to recognize progress, not by grand leaps, but by tiny, almost invisible victories. The first time Ash sniffed at a puddle without backing away. The first time Milo didn't tremble when the garbage truck clattered past. These small moments felt like threads being woven into something whole again, something strong enough to hold them all. In the afternoons, Jonas would take them with him, on guided tours through the sanctuary grounds. Visitors often gathered in small groups, led by staff or volunteers, to learn about local wildlife and the importance of respecting their natural habitats. Ash and Milo would sit quietly by Jonas's side, their collars shining softly in the sun, as he spoke about resilience. How every creature that found its way here had a story, and how survival often depended on trust. At first, Jonas kept the pups behind a small fence while he spoke, unsure if they were ready to meet strangers. But it was the children who changed his mind. One afternoon, a little girl with pale hair and nervous hands stood at the edge of the tour group. She didn't say anything, didn't reach for the reptiles, or laugh when the raccoons scrambled across the enclosure fence. She just watched Ash, her eyes steady but full of something unspoken. Ash noticed her too. He tilted his head, ears twitching, and then, without Jonas prompting him, he took a step forward. His paws were slow, deliberate, but his gaze never left hers. When he stopped just inches away, the girl crouched down, her small hands hovering in the air. Jonas waited, holding his breath. Ash leaned in. He pressed his nose softly into her palm. The girl's face lit up like someone had opened a window and let the sun flood in. She let out a small laugh, not loud, but pure, and whispered something to Ash that Jonas couldn't hear. Ash stood there, tail swaying gently, like he understood every word. After that day, Jonas began bringing both puppies to every educational tour. Milo, though cautious at first, developed a knack for sensing people's moods. He would linger near adults who seemed distracted or tense, pressing his warm head against their knees as if to remind them to breathe. Ash preferred children, especially those who sat quietly at the edges, as though he recognized the weight they carried. "They're not just dogs anymore," Delaney remarked one afternoon as she watched them from the clinic window. "They're teachers." Jonas nodded. He didn't have another word for it. They were healing in ways that went beyond bones and fur. Their presence spoke louder than anything he could say. Proof that scars, no matter how deep, could give way to something softer. Something that made room for love again. At home, the transformation continued. Meals had turned from tense, coaxing moments into a lively ritual. Ash and Milo would sit side by side as Jonas prepared their bowls, tails brushing against the floor in quiet anticipation. They ate with steady, unhurried bites, now pausing occasionally to glance up at Jonas, as though to say, "Thank you for staying." The red rubber ball still lived in the yard, scuffed from countless soft chases. Ash no longer stumbled when he ran. His legs, once weak and wobbly, now carried him with confidence, though his pace remained measured, almost thoughtful. Milo, ever the playful shadow, had learned to circle Ash, nudging him forward, letting him lead when he dared. Evenings were the slowest, sweetest part of the day. Jonas would sit on the porch with a mug of tea, the wood beneath his feet, warm from the sun's memory. Ash would lie stretched across the step, watching the fireflies blink in the tall grass, while Milo would curl close, head resting on Jonas's foot like a weightless stone. It was during these quiet hours that Jonas noticed the change in himself. For years he had carried a kind of invisible heaviness, the residue of countless rescues, the heartbreak of animals that couldn't be saved, the endless cycle of trying and losing. But with Ash and Milo, something had shifted. Their presence felt like a mirror reflecting his own resilience back at him. He wasn't just their guardian. They were his. The physical scars on the pups had faded by now. Ash's stitches had dissolved, leaving only faint lines along his rib cage, and Milo's scrapes had vanished beneath new fur. But Jonas knew the deeper wounds weren't as easy to see. Sometimes Ash still startled at shadows. Sometimes Milo would freeze for no reason, his ears flicking as though listening for echoes only he could hear. Jonas never pushed them when those moments came. He simply sat beside them, a steady warmth, a reminder that not every sound meant danger. Not every silence meant abandonment. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in gold, a group of children visited for a special education session. Jonas knelt on the grass, Ash and Milo sitting obediently at his side. He spoke about wildlife, about the importance of compassion and patience. But his voice softened when he mentioned the pups. "They came to us scared and hurt," he told the group. "But they remind me every day that healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about finding something worth trusting again." A boy raised his hand. "Are they happy now?" Jonas looked down. Ash was watching the boy with quiet eyes, and Milo had tilted his head, his ears perked. Jonas smiled. "Yes, they're happy." That night, after the visitors had gone and the sanctuary had settled into its nocturnal hum, Jonas sat on the porch again with the pups at his feet. The sky was clear, the stars like fine salt scattered across black velvet. Ash shifted, pressing his head against Jonas's knee while Milo leaned heavily against his other side. Jonas reached down, running his hands slowly over their backs. The scars were no longer visible, but he felt them, and somehow they made the moment even more beautiful. The cottage lights glowed warm against the darkness, and as Jonas closed his eyes, the soft rhythm of Ash and Milo breathing beside him felt like the purest reminder that some wounds, even when unseen, can give rise to the deepest kind of peace. A year had passed. In the quiet hours of the morning, before the light fully breached the horizon, the old ranger's cottage stood like a gentle heartbeat at the edge of the Cypress Grove sanctuary. A modest home surrounded by the rustle of sawgrass and the distant calls of waking birds. Inside, the rhythm of life had settled into something so tender, so unspoken, it barely needed explanation. Ash, once the silent shadow trembling in a clinic corner, now ran with an awkward enthusiasm that sent leaves flying in his path. His gait was still a little uneven, a slight echo of the injury that had almost taken him. But there was no hesitation in the way he chased after Milo across the fenced yard. And Milo, with his sleek coat and bright eyes, had developed a peculiar habit of stealing Jonas's blanket every morning, dragging it triumphantly across the floor, tail wagging like a flag of mischief. Jonas had given up trying to stop him. Instead, he'd lie still, eyes half closed, listening to the shuffle of paws and the soft jingle of collars. It was a sound that meant the day had begun, and that once again they were all still here. The cottage had become a true home. The walls were no longer bare. Pinned to the wood were snapshots of everyday moments, Ash asleep with a toy tucked beneath his chin, Milo tangled in a pile of laundry, the three of them together on the porch with the orange wash of sunset in the background. There were scratches on the floorboards and tufts of fur in corners Jonas never quite managed to sweep clean. But these things never bothered him. They were signs of life, imperfect, chaotic, and absolutely beautiful. Each evening, like clockwork, both dogs settled by the front window. It had become their favorite place. The sill was low enough for them to rest their heads while still keeping watch over the sanctuary. From there, they could see the winding dirt paths. The flicker of lanterns hung along the trail, and sometimes the flickering silhouettes of deer grazing just beyond the clearing. It wasn't just a habit. It was a ritual. Ash would lie closest to the glass, his eyes scanning the woods, as if still guarding something precious, while Milo curled behind him, pressed close, always touching, always near. Sometimes they fell asleep like that, two bodies framed in silver light, bathed in the quiet of nightfall. But not every night was silent. Some nights Ash still stirred in his sleep. His legs would twitch, breath hitching, as if reliving a memory he couldn't escape. And on those nights, Jonas would rise, without a word, crossing the floor barefoot, his hand finding the space between Ash's shoulders, fingers moving slowly in circles, until the tremors eased, until the room exhaled and peace returned. Jonas never spoke during those moments. He didn't need to, because something deeper than language connected them now. Something forged in fear and held together by gentleness. And it went both ways. There were days when Jonas found himself adrift in thought, weighed down by the things he'd once buried, the years of emotional numbness that came after too many losses. The silence he had worn like armor. The loneliness that had followed him even into crowded rooms. He had learned to function without feeling, to smile politely, while something inside him stood still. But Ash and Milo changed that. They forced him to be present, to notice the texture of fur beneath his hands, to laugh when a bowl of kibble spilled across the floor, to stop and watch the way sunlight played across a dozing body stretched in the grass. They asked nothing from him, except that he stay, that he listen, that he offer kindness without needing to explain it. And in giving that, Jonas found something he didn't expect: healing. It was never loud, never dramatic. It came in the form of shared silence, of trust, rebuilt one moment at a time. He had saved them, yes, pulled them from the jaws of something merciless, but they had returned the favor in full. They had drawn him out of the fog. They had reminded him of what it meant to care so deeply that you let yourself be vulnerable again. Sometimes visitors to the sanctuary would ask about the dogs. "Are they yours?" they'd say, watching Ash and Milo walk faithfully beside him on the trails. And Jonas would always pause before answering, not because he didn't know, but because the word "mine" didn't feel quite right. "They're part of my life," he'd reply instead. "We chose each other." On a crisp morning near the anniversary of the rescue, Jonas sat on the back porch with a notebook in hand, a mug of coffee balanced on the railing beside him. Ash and Milo played quietly in the grass, chasing the last of the autumn butterflies, their shadows dancing across the golden blades. He had been asked to write an article for the sanctuary's newsletter, something personal, something real. At first he didn't know how to begin, but as he watched the dogs roll and tumble under the soft light of morning, the words began to form. He wrote about the day he first saw them. The violent splash, the flash of scales, the scream in his throat as he jumped into the water. He wrote about the fear, the desperation, the blood on his hands as he cradled their tiny broken bodies. But more than that, he wrote about the days that followed, the healing. The laughter, the way Milo curled beside him after every long shift, the way Ash's eyes found his, even in the dark. He wrote about how loving them had taught him to love himself again. When he finished, he didn't reread it. He just closed the notebook and set it aside, choosing instead to join them in the yard. Milo barked playfully, darting toward him with a stick in his mouth, while Ash followed with slow, steady steps, his head held high, tail wagging in wide, easy arcs. Jonas laughed his arms wide, and both dogs crashed into him with joyful force, knocking him backward into the grass. They lay there, all three of them, under the sky that had watched it all, wrapped in the kind of peace that doesn't need to be named to be known. That night after dinner and their usual patrol of the yard, Ash and Milo climbed onto the couch beside Jonas. They curled into their usual spots, Milo against his ribs, Ash against his thigh. And within minutes their breathing slowed, their bodies melted into sleep. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Outside, the wind rustled the branches. Jonas reached out and rested a hand gently on each dog. And in the quiet glow of that ordinary evening, he knew with absolute certainty he had been saved too. Not from danger, but from distance, from silence, from a version of himself that had forgotten how to feel. Ash stirred once in his sleep, a soft whimper caught in his throat. Jonas didn't move his hand. He just whispered, "I'm here," and let the warmth of that promise carry them all into the night. And as the moon rose over the sanctuary, its light falling like a silver blessing across the roof of their little home, one truth remained steady as the stars above: the ones who were saved had never been just dogs.